see the world through other people's eyes. Now, empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.
Hi, it's Edwin Rutsch from the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy. And today I'm here in dialogue with Sylvia Clute. And Sylvia is I'm looking at your bio here, and it says you're an author, an attorney in Richmond, Virginia, and presently engaged in the creation and implementation of unitive justice systems in a high school. And I've come across your blog post as well, where you write about unitive justice, and you seem to be a proponent for that way of that form of justice, as well as you've written a couple of books, and one of them I see is called Beyond Vengeance, Beyond Duality, A Call for Compassionate Revolution, and happens to be on the bookshelf behind you. Would you like to say a little bit more about yourself by way of introduction?
Well, I come to unitive justice via punitive justice. I was a trial attorney for 28 years, and I actually entered law school when there were quotas for women and minorities, and I was told I would be studying the best legal system that could be designed, and didn't know any better than to accept that representation. But as I got into that system, I realized that I did tort litigation, plaintiffs. I handled plaintiff cases. Some of it was medical malpractice, breach of contract, divorce, various types of civil litigation. And I began to realize about halfway through that career that people came to me, clients came to me basically with broken relationships. And an interesting thing about the punitive justice system is that relationships are basically irrelevant. You go into court to win by making the other party lose. And the fact that there's a breach in the relationship is irrelevant. You're not there to address the relationship, to try to heal it, to bring the parties together so that they can continue. And I simply began to believe that that wasn't the best that we could do. Well, what happened in the courtroom, oftentimes, even when we won, we'd walk out and know that there was a huge loss in that win, a cost to be paid for that win.
Yeah.
So, in fact, actually no one really wins in the sense that you can in unitive justice. And unitive justice is entirely different moral roots, different goals, objectives, principles. It is about healing and restoration, and when it's really on point, transformation, seeking a mutually beneficial outcome, not win-lose like we do in the legal system, but not even a compromise where each party gets some of what they want but not all of what they want. When it's very successful, the outcome is mutually beneficial. So everyone walks away feeling that they have won and they haven't had to lose anything in order for that to happen.
Yeah, I'm just showing your blog right now, and it shows Genuine Justice at genuinejustice.com. And you've written a lot about restorative justice or unitive justice for quite some time now. So I was getting a little bit of an echo so I was trying to speak a little bit softly here. How do you see, what I'm looking at is the relationship of how do we build a culture of empathy? How do we foster and nurture empathy within society? And I think that goes over into the justice system too. How do we transform justice so that it's about empathy and connection versus competition and just a pure focus on punishment?
Yes, actually shifting from the punitive model of justice to what I call unitive justice is essential in order to have a justice system that does that. Let me just explain a little bit about the term unitive justice and how that's different from restorative justice. In the United States, restorative justice grew out of the criminal court system. it was a process associated with the criminal courts where, as a adjunct process, the victim and offender, the parties involved in the harm and the crime would be brought together. And in a circle process, much more information about context could come in. And so they could arrive at outcomes where all the parties were able to participate in it. But that system often retained many of the punitive elements. The offender often had to admit guilt to even qualify to be in the circle. The goal was to hold the offender accountable, not a mutually beneficial outcome. And people were labeled offender, victim. Unitive justice steps away from all of those. So we're in the school, we call it the restorative school program, but we're seeking a restorative program founded on unitive principles, and that means it's free of those punitive elements. So I coined the term unitive justice to be able to distinguish a particular type of justice that appears to be mutually exclusive from the punitive one. As I said, different moral roots, totally different, although I don't think that they are opposites like hot and cold, male and female, that type of thing. I think that actually unitive justice, which is grounded in love, punitive justice is grounded in fear. I think that love is really the basis of the universe, and when we're not present to that, because we're in fear, we're lost in duality, we're not seeing that love that's there. So unitive justice is not accessible. But I think that when you remove the punitive elements, what naturally appears, what surfaces is unitive justice. So in that system, it is all about empathy and compassion, but because that's the natural outcome of what happens. For example, a situation that occurred at the school was a student who had a lot of difficulties, many problems, and was causing a lot of difficulties for a teacher, cursing at the teacher, swearing, walking out of the classroom, flipping the lights on and off, just very angry. And the student came into a restorative circle process saying that he was going to keep disobeying the rules until they kicked him out because he didn't want to be there. But in the circle, what happened was we start with one specific incident, and then that creates a safe space for there to be a conversation, and that leads into the conflict dynamic, and the parties can see what's going on. So what happened, what surfaced was that the teacher was making him sit in the back row, and he wanted to sit in, the teacher was making him sit in the front row, and he wanted to sit in the back row. When I asked the teacher, why is it important for him to be sitting in the front row, he says, because I want to see that he's doing his work, and when he was in the back row, he pulled stuff off the bulletin board. So in the process, you ask the student, what did you hear the teacher say, and there's that exchange. And then I said to the student, why is it important for you to sit in the back row? And he said, because when he was in detention, it was never safe if he couldn't see who was behind him. So I asked the teacher, what did you hear him say? And the teacher said, I hear him saying he doesn't feel safe in my room when I have him sitting in the front row. And I asked the student, is that it? And he said, yes, that's it. Well, there was a lot of empathy that teacher, who'd been totally frustrated before, felt for this student. And the teacher said, I will see that you have a seat in my room where you feel safe, and in return, I want you to do your work. So the student agreed to that. So this was the win-win outcome that they came to. They both walked out feeling much better, and that student didn't continue to behave that way for that teacher. So that demonstrates all of those pieces and how empathy comes up. That student felt really honored and heard, and then responded to that because immediately the teacher responded. The teacher was clearly touched by learning that the student was not feeling safe in his room. So that's, the empathy of these students who, many of them have a lot of difficulties, but I have the privilege of seeing them in a space where they're forgiving and they demonstrate a generosity of spirit, and empathy is just part and parcel of the whole process when it's working. It's beautiful. And it is a model of justice that empathy, it just is. It just is a part of it.
Well, you're mentioning kind of two systems, kind of one based on fear, and then the other based on love. It sounds like, and the unitive justice would be based on the love, the
Yes,
value of
exactly.
love, and the quality of love. For myself, you know, you've coined the term unitive justice. I've coined the term restorative empathy, uh, which is the same thing. We're talking about the same thing, but it's highlighting the importance of empathy within the relationships. It's like the justice doesn't wait for the problem to happen. The empathy is already the overall context, the overall value that we're trying to promote within the classroom. And if something happens, we want to restore the empathic connection or create empathic connections that weren't there. And for me, the empathy is like, you know, if love is get 100%, empathy is like, you know, is the first steps towards that. It's the first, you know, 10, you know, 20 miles to on the 100-mile journey. So,
Well, what's exciting in this moment in time is that there are so many people approaching the same problem from different perspectives, and it is a tapestry that's being woven that's beautiful. And as that comes together and is strengthened, and you know, there are many paths to the top of the mountain. So I think that the fact that it's expressed in different ways, that the structures are designed in ways that suit the particular need, and yet the underpinning is still the same, ultimately a loving, holistic community and way of being is what we're all seeking, is clearly where we're going. So I applaud your work on this, and the way you expressed it is a beautiful way to put it.
well, your video is slowing down a little bit, so I'm going to stop the video going to you, my video, so that perhaps that will increase the bandwidth and I hope speed up.
Okay?
So I'm hoping, yeah, it helped a little bit.
Okay.
So yeah, so what do you think in terms of the direction of empathy? Because you know, there's a local restorative, well, a local mediation center here in Berkeley. It's called Seeds, and I've been in the workshops, and they tend to see empathy as like one of the components to help towards restorative justice. And I tend to see restorative justice as a process for creating an empathic environment. And so I have a little bit of a, you know, framing kind of discussion with them. And you're saying there's a lot of different paths, you know, to where we want to go. And this is kind of addressing that. But it seems that kind of focusing on the empathy component is to even create an environment before we get to the problems that we want this culture of empathy, that it's like something that we're kind of, it's something that's like a vision or a goal. You know what I mean? Does that make sense?
Yes, it does, but the way you expressed it would be the way I would see it in unitive justice. That unitive justice is a container for empathy. I mean, empathy is just an essential, necessary, almost inescapable part of a successful unitive justice system. They're one and the same. You couldn't have unitive justice without empathy. And empathy would certainly be a motivator and a reason for wanting to create a unitive justice system or a restorative justice system. You know, what happens when there's a restorative justice program, even if it's associated with the criminal courts and retains some of the elements of that punitive system, it's still so much better than the pure punitive system that, and I totally support that process and think it's important as an evolutionary step in our legal system evolving.
Yeah, well, I've been to some restorative justice, meetings here, and what I'm finding is that, there's a metaphor for justice, and the metaphor is the scale, right? So it's kind of based on this notion of balancing the scales, just when you bring up the term justice. Whereas the metaphor for empathy is it's about reconnecting, right? It's about the people kind of standing in each other's shoes and reconnecting. And so one of the problems I've had within the restorative justice, within that world, I've just seen that there's so much confusion about what justice means, that the people were kind of arguing, they were mixing up punitive and restorative, and because there's not a clear delineation between the two.
May I offer a clear delineation?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Punitive justice is grounded in the moral principle of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. It's a system of proportional revenge, and the justice lies in the harm you do to those who harm you being proportional, being equal. And that's what those scales of justice represent. They represent proportional revenge, that the eyes gouged out are to be equal to the teeth bashed in. Very clear model of justice. It underpins our criminal law system and our civil law system. It's a system of proportional revenge, and it's a system in which harm answers harm. And those scales of justice, I know, we're not told specifically that they represent proportional revenge, but that's what it is. It's a system of proportional revenge. And unitive justice is a system built on the moral principle that harm to anyone by anyone for any reason is not morally justified. So when a harm occurs, we do not answer harm with harm. We find ways to address the harm. Yes, absolutely, we address the harm. We do not let it continue. But we find ways to address the harm that are healing and restorative, where the outcome is mutually beneficial, instead of a win-lose system that, as I said earlier, is really a lose-lose system. The unitive model of justice, where no one has to lose, it's not answering harm with harm, but rather using the energy that emerges out of a harm as the engine that drives the healing and the transformation and the restoration. For the healing process to occur, there needs to be an emotional investment in it. And so that's what the harm can provide. It gives a reason for the people to come together, to engage, and to stick with it. But it's also this window, it's like a pearl to be harvested, that leads to a healing, empathetic, compassionate, mutually beneficial outcome. So when you have that distillation, there isn't any confusion. If it's about getting even, if it's about revenge of any type, that's punitive justice. If you give up getting even, getting your pound of flesh, your eye for an eye, and you're really going for, when you see the harm as the cry for love, and you're willing to answer that cry for what's cried for, then you get into this space where miracles happen, where it's really beautiful. And anyway, when they're clearly defined, there's no confusion between the two. They're actually mutually exclusive. When you have one, you don't have the other. Mm-hmm. If you find one element of one and you think, well, what would be the opposite? That will take you to the other system.
Okay, there we go. Yeah, so I guess it's for me. What are the ways that we can build this? I call it a culture of empathy, and how can we build a culture of empathy? And you mentioned, and for me, it's like restorative justice, unitive justice has a whole set of processes that kind of address these conflicts. And in fact, I have a quote here that I wanted to just read, and this is from Johann Galtung, who is a well-known peace I guess activist, but he started these peace and conflict studies programs in the universities. And he says, by peace we mean the capacity to transform conflicts with empathy, without violence, creativity, and it's a never-ending process.
Right.
So it's really, for me, to build a culture of empathy, you know, the unitive justice is kind of like, has this process for resolving conflicts and creating connection between people. So when connection gets lost, well, we just bring in this process to restore connection between people, and, you know, create this culture or this environment of connection and empathy.
That's true. There are certain rules, however, that are essential, so it's not something that you bring in and impose on anyone. It's important to preserve the integrity of the system, and therefore it has to be voluntary. So everyone has to come to it of their own volition. So what you can do is make it available, and as people experience it, more and more people will choose that system. But it's important that we not think of it as something that we can impose on anyone, because that goes right to the core of, well, it violates the underlying principles that are essential to preserve if you want to achieve the maximum healing and restorative capacity.
Yeah, you're not wanting to impose it, saying you have to do this, but kind of give people the choice to engage in this process.
Yes, but when you build the system, and prior to this year in working in the school, I studied the theory for about 20 years. So this is actually the first opportunity to work with the principles and to attempt to create a system where you apply those principles, and we are learning so much. It's like being in a laboratory. It's wonderful, amazing, difficult. We're swimming upstream in a system that's going the different direction most of the time, and yet what we're learning is amazing. So if you build the system, it's available. As people have the opportunity to experience it, and more people come in to give it a try, then people can come back again. It just, you know, it grows, it becomes stronger. When you're going into a system which is based on the punitive model, I think that there's no escaping the fact that you have to have parallel systems for a good period of time. The unitive system is not going to address all the problems that a punitive system can address. Many of those problems that have actually been produced by the punitive system, the brokenness, not dealing with the conflict until it becomes very bad, and so you've got a lot of brokenness in that system. The brokenness is expressed. If the people involved in that are not willing or may not be able to come into the unitive system, then you simply have to have, I mean, for the people to be safe for a period of time, you have to have the parallel system. Mm-hmm. For example, we have students that come into our circle, and we have a security staff person in the circle, because we know that some of the students have for so long, for their lives, the only tool that they have known or experienced to deal with their hurt is to fight. And so we're giving them new tools. But as that transition is made, it's just, I can tell you, it's just a fact that we have to see that they're safe in doing that. And it's a tinderbox. They can very quickly revert to fighting, which that's a norm that they practice. They talk about their parents having taught them to fight as a way to survive. So it's really interesting in the way that it is a process. It's an evolutionary process. For a period of time, it will be necessary to have parallel systems. But as one becomes stronger and people choose it, then the punitive system simply becomes less strong. And I can see now clearly how that process will evolve over time.
Sounds like you're getting some real hands-on, in the trenches kind of experience there with.
It's hands-on in the trenches.
Yeah, so I guess we're kind of where I'm coming from is feeling that we need to have like a social movement behind this. You know, it's like to create I call it a culture of empathy. It's like saying we need to raise the value of empathy within society and try to transform, you know, so there's a conscious, clearly articulated vision for where we want to go with them, you know, and I don't know if that's making sense, but it's to, for example, to bring empathy into the schools. It helps to have the society say, hey, we want empathy within society, so we're going to support those programs, and we're going to start thinking how we can, you know, change society so it's more supportive of empathy and promoting empathy. For example, we see what's going on in the Congress and what's kind of modeled there, and it's total, you know, battle and lack of empathy. And this is what, you know, children are seeing. They're seeing this modeled, the demeaning and the, you know, the name calling and all that. They see it modeled in society.
I know, why do we expect our children not to bully one another when that's how the adults behave? That's a question I ask all the time. You know, even in the school, sometimes I see students being treated in a way that if it was done by students, it would clearly be called bullying. I don't know when it's done by adults that it deserves any other name. And yes, the kids model it. When I teach about the two models of justice, I talk to the kids about a fight in the hall is just proportional revenge. You know, it's the same punitive model of justice. Someone has hurt you or made you angry, so you're going to go hurt them back. And we talk about how we do the same thing in our criminal courts, how suspensions in school are the same, but also how giving and receiving is just an inescapable universal principle. So if you answer harm with harm, that harm comes back and, you know, it gets you. There's no escape from it. And so we talk with the students about how do suspensions versus school administration. You know, the administrators are there to educate. They want good graduation rates. Suspensions harm the graduation rates, make it much more difficult for students to graduate, so then those bad figures reflect poorly on the administration. It harms parents because the parents have to take off from work, their kids are at home, they're not supervised, worried about them getting into more trouble. They do get into more trouble. And so we talk about how that system of punishment, no one escapes it. And so if we can build a system about giving and about healing and restoration, it'll be the same. As we seek to heal others, that's what we're going to get back in return. And I think that put in those terms, they are able to grasp that and understand it, and then are willing to help build this system. And, you know, I don't use the word empathy, but empathy is so integral to the whole thing that easily we could. It's just if you make this shift, empathy becomes a part of it. Because in this space, and when you get to the real truth and that underlying conflict dynamic, you are so present to the human needs of the other person, and they so reflect your own needs that it's inescapable. You know, you're going to be empathetic. You're going to see yourself in that person. So to create spaces where that can happen will certainly increase empathy in this country.
Well, one of the questions I ask is, what does a culture of empathy look like? And I think you're kind of touching on it. It's that seeing the humanity, you know, the common humanity of someone else. It's like it's creating an environment where that becomes more widespread and more the norm. So what is a culture, you know, is that what a culture of empathy would look like to you? And what would be kind of the manifestations of a school system that has a lot of empathy and connection?
Well, yes, it would be one where when there's a conflict, they see that as an opportunity to get in that space where they're really honest with each other and they see the underlying need, why that cry for attention, why striking out is happening. You know, you're really honest and present to the root of it. And in that space, as I said, you're so present to the humanity in the other person that reflects back to you your own humanity that, I mean, empathy is inescapable in that place. So clearly we can create systems and use this dynamic of conflict to take people to a place where empathy is safe and natural and emerges. And when you begin to have that experience, it definitely changes you. I mean, sometimes it's like the connection is so strong. It's like, I don't know, the miracle is a word that comes to mind. Like you feel like you've experienced something totally different from your normal human experience. And once there's that connection with a person, I mean, empathy, you've got a cord of empathy between the two of you. It'll never be the same.
Yeah, it's like when we have that awareness, I mean, I sense when I have that awareness of someone else and see the core of the feeling and experience who they are, it's like I just naturally want to contribute to their well-being.
Yes, and you know, that's what is so clear in this process. So for example, in the punitive system, when we're holding the offender accountable, and the system defines in a very linear way. You know, there's a crime, you want to know who did it and what the punishment is. So you're looking at punishment, what's the proportional amount of punishment that we're going to inflict on them, and you totally miss this opportunity for this miracle where when the person who's been injured connects with the humanity of the person who injured them, and the person who we would call a victim sees that by helping the person who injured him or her, that the harm that the victim experienced can actually be given value by helping the person who harmed them so that other people aren't hurt. So unitive justice is not linear like punitive justice is. It's very holistic and it's like a spiral, but it's very dynamic. So you've got this person who we would call the victim who ends up wanting to help the offender because by doing that, they receive healing in knowing that their harm that they experienced is not a loss, because by helping the person who harmed them, they help other people. And then you've got the person who was harmed recognizing that they are valued and amazed that this person who they harmed would see value in them, and that, you know, that changes them and gives them the motivation to actually heal themselves and change their life. So it's all of this dynamic that we lose when we get into this narrow, linear definition of what justice is to look like. And when you get into that space and allow it to happen, you don't know what the win-win outcome is, it has to emerge. The people there create it. Only they hold the wisdom that can create that mutually beneficial outcome. So you simply create the safe space and then that emerges. And it's amazing. And when you see it, you wouldn't want to go back to a courtroom. Actually, these students have moved me to tears so many times. There's one security guard who's been in a number of circles with me, and she and I have just cried. It's been so beautiful. And I don't recall a single time in 28 years where I was ever moved to tears in a courtroom.
Yeah, it sounds very beautiful. I think that's it's like seeing conflict as something to be addressed, and it's something that breaks, but with empathy is like super glue. It's even stronger than the original.
Absolutely, absolutely. That is a perfect description of what happens. It is a super glue.
Yeah, so it's, well, in terms of conflict, I mean, I see conflict happening in my life just all the time. It's like these small bits of conflict, like, oh, someone's not paying attention to me, or they're ignoring me, or, you know what I mean? It's like there's these, life is kind of just full of these little conflicts, like,
It's part of the human condition.
Yeah.
Going to happen, and the question really is, how are we going to address it? How are we going to answer it? What is there to be gained from it, or how much are we going to continually lose by wanting this proportional revenge and seeking retribution and answering harm with harm?
Yeah, it doesn't seem to really address. It doesn't. It just kind of, I guess, snowballs with.
Yes. Well, as many people have said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth will give you a blind and a toothless world. We know that, but we continue to do it. That's been something that has mystified me. But I think that if you look at the moral principles underneath, that proportional revenge system is based on dual morality. It's where the harm that you do to those who harmed you, you of course see as moral because you're the good person. And in fact, you blame the person who you're hurting for the hurt that you're doing to them because they make you do it. And then you're blind to the fact that the person on the other end has the same dual standard of morality, and they have hurt you because they believe they're justified in doing it. They're the good person, you're the bad person. And so it's this insanity that goes on endlessly, with both sides being self-righteous in their harming of the other. And we see that in the world today. Every war, foreign policy, so much of it is based on those double standards of morality. And then in unitive justice, there's one standard of morality that applies to everybody. And that is, harm to anyone by anyone is not acceptable. Enemies, friends, family members, whoever it is, we do not answer harm with harm. One single standard of morality applies to everyone. And so, you produce very different results when you have a double standard of morality, where you apply one standard of morality to yourself and a very different standard of morality to other people. And you can't get out of that trap. It's really a blindness that you're stuck in until you see, experience, somehow come to figure out that dual morality is a losing game. I mean, it just is a loss continuously. And then seeking ways to actually create systems based on one standard of morality where we don't answer harm with harm. Instead, we see the harm that's done as a cry for love, an opportunity to use the energy, the emotion that arises out of that to create this space where this generosity of spirit emerges and healing and transformation comes out of it.
Well, you were talking about kind of a cause and effect, momentum of the punitive system. It's like, so it creates kind of like a dynamic of its own. And what I'm seeing about empathy is like everybody wants empathy and they feel like they're not getting enough. and they're kind of like struggling for it. It's almost it's like, how do you start that positive chain of events with the empathy? So it's like you go into the schools. The school teachers feel like society is not valuing them. They feel like they're being demeaned. It goes on to the maybe the kids, or and then within the government. So it's this whole kind of dynamic that kind of gets set up, and people want to be heard, and they're not being heard, and nobody has the energy to be the person to kind of start the ball rolling. I mean, I'm exaggerating here, of course,
Right.
but
It's absolutely true. That's the way it works.
Mm,
Yes, that's the way it works. You get caught in duality and this dualistic thinking of us versus them, and it's a trap. And you're caught in it. It's quicksand.
yeah, and well, I'm really. It's just as I've seen in the dialogue with you, just as in your writing, you're very nuanced, very insightful, and you really dig into these topics. And your website is a real treasure trove of insight around this. So
Yeah, well, I'm interested in, I call it the blueprint of the two models of justice. Because if we get the blueprint of each of them, then you can see how they're constructed, why they produce what they produce, and that makes it easier to create the new system when you've got the blueprint of both of them. So that's what I've been working on.
mm-hmm. Kind of an
And there are
analysis of the systems, kind of.
systems analysis.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they're very different, and we definitely can replace one with the other. And then when you begin to see these two systems, you can understand things like the Sermon on the Mount in an entirely different light. In the Sermon on the Mount, where Christ said an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth is the old covenant. So he was telling us to leave an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Well, that's that punitive model of justice, proportional revenge. It's the one we still have embedded in our legal system. It justifies war and all of the harm that we answer harm with in the world. But specifically for Christians, Christ said, that's the old covenant. I bring a new covenant. Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. Turn the other cheek. And I don't think we could imagine, we didn't have the blueprint to that new covenant. We couldn't imagine what it looks like. But now with the systems that are being created, we're still in the infancy of figuring it out. But I can see a new covenant. Clearly, it's a break from the past, totally. And it addresses all of those things that we were called to do. And then when you look at all of the major religious traditions in the world, they all have similar teaching. So it's not at all limited to Christianity, but clearly in the Sermon on the Mount, when you have these two blueprints, that takes on an understanding that I never had before.
Yeah, so it's kind of developing this new vision of the vision. I just put the name on Culture of Empathy because I think it's really about deepening empathy throughout society and changing the social structures so that they are structurally foster empathy. And so that's kind of how I'm looking, is how do we transform those social structures in all ways, in the government, in education, in justice, in commerce, personally. And I think now, we have we have science starting to say, hey, empathy, we're actually wired for empathy for, hundreds of years. The philosophers and the academics and scientists have tended to say, well, we're these greedy, selfish, beings, and everybody's in it for themselves, and you better be in it for yourself too, or you're going to get taken advantage of. And now the science is saying, that's not really how it is. That humans are, these animals, that are social. We're social animals, Homo empathicus. So I think now that we have kind of scientific studies, science kind of showing how this works, especially through the science of mirror neurons, that really shows that we are wired to connect with each other. And it's maybe fear that actually is what kind of shrinks that connection. So as we become afraid, our 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 openness and empathy kind of shrinks as we focus on that object of fear. So if we're living in a culture of high fear, our empathy is going down, and we need to kind of speak to those fears and widen that ambit or that awareness of others.
Right. In the book, the biology of belief, that was set out so clearly where the individual cells actually are continually reading the environment for fear or love. And if the environment, if they're sensing fear, then they go into survival mode. If they're sensing love, then they can be healthy and productive and really flourish. So it goes back to that same thing, and we can go even farther. We can go to quantum physics, where they've discovered now that the material world is really an illusion. Our senses perceive the material world, but in fact we're in a field of energy. There is no separation. The separation is an illusion. So yes, absolutely, we are all interconnected. Separation does not exist in the way that we have thought it has in the past at all. And so, yeah, I think that it's inevitable that we're heading in this direction, because when I was in school, I was taught atomic theory, that there were material particles, separated by empty space, and that's sort of how you and I are and all of the other things in the world. And my children and grandchildren, they learned that's not the truth at all. In fact, we're all interconnected. That what happens, particles, if you take a piece of a particle and put the other piece in another part of the universe, there's a connection there that is beyond time and space. So we are so much more. That's what I see continually in working with this. We are so much more than I was ever taught when we were taught atomic theory, and that was a reflection of us. No, we are so much more, and it's so beautiful. And empathy is totally just innate in us. We just have to have the space where it's safe for that to emerge, and we're not in survival mode because we're afraid, closing everything down.
Well, we've been going for about an hour now, and you're slowly fading to black there, because your light is fading. So this might be a good point to end for now. And we are doing an online conference around empathy in the justice system. So I invite you to get together with some other people. We can have some panel discussions via Skype, and I've talked to Kim Wright about it and some others. So I hope we can keep this dialogue going.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you so much. I enjoyed it.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for the work that you're doing. Beautiful.
See the world through other people's eyes. Empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.